All right, welcome back. We're gonna now talk a little bit about the last few regions of the brain, and then talk about some of the cranial nerves that we're gonna be discussing as the last part of this chapter. So, the cerebellum is the other major region of the brain that has a lot of neurons. So this has about 50% of the neurons of the brain. A lot less white matter in this area. That's why it's a little bit more compact. Two major functions when it comes to this. It's really posture and coordination. Uh, Lots of interconnections necessary, lots of synapses necessary to do a lot of this processing, especially for coordination. It's a matter of, like I said, even something as simple as tossing a ball and catching it. It's a matter of being able to coordinate where the muscles are at, how contracted they are, where you have to move them to in order to just do something as simple as catch something that's thrown to you. So it is a lot with that. So again, keeping that posture, keeping you upright when you're awake, as well as, like I said, fine-tuning a lot of these pathways and using a lot of other information to know where the muscles are at, where the joints are at, so we can do a smooth movement. Again, it is not triggering these skeletal muscle movements, but it is helping them to follow a smoother pattern, helping them to do it in a more coordinated fashion. Helps with some of our learned movements as well. Again, ensuring that coordination. Also helps us maintain posture, so proprioceptive stuff, how contracted are these muscles, where is your body at in position relative to like where the joints are at. A lot of this is that proprioceptive responses, using a lot of sensory pathways. Again, helps also monitor muscular activity that is traveling through there, and we're going to see this does influence the muscle activity. We already were saying a little bit, some connections for that over to the basal ganglia is one of the way that the cerebellum is influencing this. So this is the cerebellum right here. You can see that it looks to me kind of like cauliflower when it's sliced. Humans are a little bit different than a lot of the brains we would see if we were doing like sheep brain dissection in lab, or since we're doing it more online this time, you'll be looking at a sheep brain or at least slices of a brain. Human brains do have two hemispheres to this. A lot of other animals, that there is not that center part called the vermis. We're going to see that it does have these big nerve tracts, so big bundles of nerve tracts within some of these regions. They refer to these as peduncles. I just think it's a funny word, peduncle. So there is multiple sets of these, so parts that are connecting the cerebellum to the midbrain, the cerebellum to the pons, the cerebellum to the medulla oblongata. So basically superior, middle, and inferior. Again, lots of folds on this, giving you a lot of that surface area. Again, that vermis, which you can see in the image right here, is separating the two halves of this. This is the area where, like I was saying, there is a lot of interconnection. There's a lot of parallel processing that takes place. This is the place in the brain where you have these cells that are called Purkinje cells, and I feel bad because there's also going to be Purkinje fibers in the heart. They needed to have somebody else figure out these things, so they weren't named the same. But these are the ones that have up to these 200,000 synapses. So lots of interconnection here. Again, coordination takes a ton of parallel processing. To me, it kind of looks like a tree branch in here. I always think it looks like a sliced hunk of cauliflower. But that white matter tracts that are coming from each of these gray matter areas out here, this is called the arbor vitae, or tree of life. And the cerebellum is one of these things that you can damage with things like alcohol. I mean, alcohol can temporarily affect it, and that gives you that loss of coordination and reaction time. They refer to this as ataxia. So, again, not something you should be doing too much of. The other part of the brain that we still need to talk about is the brainstem. This is really a combination of three main parts, kind of going from the most superior to inferior, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Like it says there, each of these is about 1 inch in length. There is gray matter with a lot of it being surrounded by white matter tracts. A lot of times when we talk about the brainstem, I always kind of refer to this as it's kind of more of the life support regions of the brain. If you talk about somebody being brain dead, it usually means that they have brainstem function, but the higher regions of the brain, like the cerebrum, are not functioning anymore. Brainstem will keep you breathing, will keep your heart beating, things like that. So we're going to see that there is a lot of that in there. a lot of what's going on here is, again, tracks connecting the rest of the body to the upper regions of the brain, connecting brain regions to one another. That is why we see a lot of white matter tracks in here, or again, if we want to call them peduncles, we'll see a lot of peduncles in the brainstem. So in the midbrain, you do have these cerebral peduncles that are going up and taking motor commands through this area. There's a couple different sets of these also. Like it says there, those cerebral peduncles connecting the cerebellum through the midbrain up to the cerebrum. This is located in between, and it's a small section here. To me, one of the ones that does not have a, it's basically knowing what's diencephalon, knowing what's thalamus, and knowing what's pons, and the midbrain is what's in between that. Not the most obvious area. It does have what's called the corpora quadrumina, which is dealing with reflexive eye movements and reflexive movements of the head. So like that flinch response to a loud noise, for example, is some of the midbrain function. There is some specific areas in here that to me are ones that I will mention that I think are kind of important, like the substantia nigra. There's two little spots in this that are producing a lot of dopamine. It's this dopamine being signaled over to the basal ganglia that is a normal function. When that is lost, that leads to those Parkinson's diseases where you have death or damage to the substantia nigra cells. They cannot produce as much dopamine. That's really where that pathology of Parkinson's disease happens. The tegmentum is close to that area, so you can see the substantia nigra right here. The red nucleus of the tegmentum is right here. Lots of blood vessels in this area. Parts of that reticular formation we talked about. So, and a lot of connection in between the cerebrum and the cerebellum going through this area, as well as some involuntary motor commands to kind of some of your spine muscles. The other thing that's traveling through this area is part of that cerebrospinal fluid connection. That fourth ventricle is going to be in front of this area. So the cerebral aqueduct is connecting that fourth ventricle, which is going to be down in front of the cerebellum and by the pons, with the third ventricle, which is up in the diencephalon. We also will see some cranial nerves leaving this area. Again, I don't get crazy on knowing which cranial nerves are leaving which part of the midbrain. We are going to go through the cranial nerves, talk about what they do. But again, I generally don't try to have you identifying the little stumps on the brain of these cranial nerves because it is incredibly difficult to do. There's just a few that I would say, like optic nerves, the olfactory nerve. Those are kind of some of those key ones that you should be able to identify because they are distinct and separate from a lot of the rest of these. But we do have a couple cranial nerves leaving this area, the oculomotor and the trochlear, which are both dealing with eye movement, not surprisingly, because we talked about reflexive movements of the eye. The pons is this middle region. It is a bulge. It's a little bit more obvious than the other two regions of the brainstem because it does have that bulge there. It is in between the midbrain and the medulla, or the medulla oblongata. Has a number of cranial nerves leaving there, so the trigeminal, abducens, facial, and audiovestibular nerves are leaving there. The other thing that's kind of important here is it does have some of your higher order respiratory control areas here. These are dealing with maintenance of rhythm, respiratory rhythm, help kind of controlling some of what's going to happen with breathing along with speech. And not surprisingly, lots of tracks relaying information from the cerebellum up to other regions of the brain, as well as a lot of ascending and descending tracks connecting other parts of the central nervous system to the higher regions of the brain. And finally, the last part of the brain is the medulla oblongata. It is this last little portion you see here. When it leaves the foramen magnum, it is considered to be the spinal cord at that point. Has a couple regions called pyramids that are, like it says there, two longitudinal ridges along the anterior surface. Have some of these tracks that are traveling from the brain up and down. This is where the crossover takes place, is in this region. So the reason why we have the left and right kind of control opposite sides type of stuff and sensation from the opposite sides, this is where the crossing over does occur. I just think it's funny that there's a part called the olive. It relays sensory messages to the cerebellum. as well as some tracts that are connecting the medulla to the cerebellum, so some more of those peduncles. The main thing that I would say to worry about with the medulla oblongata, though, is that it has a lot of gray matter devoted, at least the gray matter that's there, that is devoted to what I kind of call life support systems. So it is going to have kind of some of these basic centers for controlling things like a heart rate and the cardiac center. So it is going to influence the ability of the heart to beat, speed it up, slow it down. It also has a vasomotor center that is going to regulate control of some of the blood vessels, deal with blood pressure, raising it or lowering it. It has the main respiratory center that is going to be influenced by the pons, but you have the medullary respiratory center, as well as we have a lot of these non-respiratory movement centers here. So things like coughing, sneezing, salivation, gagging, and emesis, so vomiting center. These are all present in the medulla. I always joke around a little bit that you have a breathing center in there and you have the vomiting center. You would think throwing up wouldn't be such an awful experience where you feel like you're puking your guts out and then you're like, seems like they could talk a little bit better since they're in the same brain region, but they don't. So that's why it's no fun. Outside of that, some somatic sensory information being relayed up through the thalamus through this area. The other main thing with the medulla, lots of cranial nerves going here. So glossopharyngeal, the vagus is kind of one of the more main ones. That is one of the only ones that is going to leave this region and go down beneath the shoulders. So it's the only cranial nerve that goes kind of inferior to the shoulders. So there's a few more of those leaving from this area. And again, I'm not so worried that, the cranial nerves, which brain region they're leaving from. Like I said, we're going to do these in the last little episode of this first set here. We're going to talk about the different cranial nerves, and you're going to need to know basically what's the number, are they sensory motor or mixed, and really what jobs are they doing. So altogether, we can kind of talk about some of these higher order mental functions. So learning, memory, reasoning. This is all within the cerebrum, again, involving multiple brain regions, some of which were stuff we're aware of, a lot of it we're not. Really, your brain is going to be developing a little bit throughout your life. It's really a lot more strengthening connections after about those first 5-10 years. So motor control, you get much better as you age. The number of cortical neurons, like it says, increases throughout your first year of life. We get a lot more myelination of axons through those first 2 years. Like it says, each of these are generally completed in the teenage years. Like I said, most of your cells by about 5 years of life are going to be there. And after that, it's a lot more of strengthening connections between certain neurons and pruning certain connections back. That's where you get a lot of that nervous system maturation, is in this increasing complexity of connections and not as much in that we get more and more cells. And again, it is, as I've said a couple of times here, a lot of this in learning is about, again, it's all about kind of like with practicing any skill. The more times you do it, the more strengthened that synaptic connections become. And if you get more connection or stronger connection, it's easier to recall, easier to tie stuff to that. So cognition is just this idea of awareness and having memory and being able to think. And again, a lot of association areas that we've talked about are important for this, both sensory and motor, and connected to both sensory and motor. A lot of what I was saying in terms of what brain regions do what was figured out due to certain brain lesions. So a lot of time, once you've developed and that plasticities went away in the brain, if you have damage to the brain, a lot of times it's going to tell you kind of the function of the area. If you lose this particular area and you lose a particular function, that region in your brain was responsible for that. So like I said, lesions to the frontal area have influenced motor and association areas, personality, somatosensory areas, can't feel certain things on the body, inability to hear sounds if you have damage to the temporal lobe. Certain regions of the cerebellum can't understand the meaning of stimuli because you can't kind of get those association areas to work together. And I think everybody's seen with strokes, loss of muscle movement, things like that. Again, memory lots of different types of it in all reality. It's a lot of these different brain regions working together. Like it says there, sensory memory lasts for a few seconds. Then you can have things like short-term memory, small pieces of information that you can have from seconds to hours. Really what a lot of the time we want to do is take stuff that's in short-term memory and encode it into long-term memory, which we can, again, exactly how we start, we don't know, but may exist in there for a really long period of time. Generally, the more you use it, the better you can retrieve it. Stuff that you don't use particularly often, sometimes it's a lot harder to remember. So again, when it comes to learning and classes, a lot of this is being able to come up with ways to use this information over and over again. So you do strengthen its encoding into long-term memory and you make it easier to access it. So I would say a lot of this, don't wait till the last second because it's only going to be in short-term memory and it will disappear there, and come up with unique ways to use things that you've kind of stored in long-term memory. So it's something when you go back to it over and over again, it becomes easier and easier to access it. That's why like students are always like, well, you all know this stuff. You went to school for all this and you know A&P, and that's why it's really hard for... I didn't know this when I went through it in college that well. It wasn't just because I completed it. You guys have completed a lot of classes, and you know that just because you finished a class doesn't mean, oh, I got to be in calculus 2. I know calculus back and front now. Give it a year, you don't know hardly any calculus. The reason with A&P I know it so well is I've been doing this for 15 years, where every time I go and talk about it multiple times a year, I have to access this information, and it's become easier and easier and easier to access it because I use it so much. It's kind of like basic math. You don't really ever stop using basic math, so it becomes easier a lot of times to do that over the years. Same idea with almost any knowledge. It's coming up with unique ways to use it multiple times to strengthen those connections. Again, we do need certain functioning areas of the brain to work in order to do proper encoding of long-term memories. If there is damage to the amygdaloid body, to the hippocampus, you're going to have an ability to store some stuff to long-term memory. I mean, not a common thing, but if you've ever seen 50 First Dates, kind of played around with it a little bit there, but there is some people like that that do have the inability to put stuff into longer-term memory. And a lot of these memories are going to be in certain association areas associated with the particular memory. So sounds in the auditory association context, sensations in the sensory association cortex. So what we'll do in this last one here is we're going to talk about the different cranial nerves, and this will be the last part of the CNS. We will then talk a little bit about the autonomic nervous system and some of the basic spinal cord kind of structure. It's a little bit more of an anatomy one, just a quick one on that. And then we'll start moving on to some of these other ones like endocrine and the rest of that.